What if I told you that the most innocent children's story you grew up with was actually one of the most subversive pieces of political commentary in American history? What if Dorothy's journey wasn't really about getting home to Kansas, but about a revolution that could have changed everything? Those glittering ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz are burned into our collective memory, aren't they? But here's something that'll surprise you. They were never supposed to be red. That single color change, made just to show off Hollywood's new Technicolor technology, accidentally hid what might be the most fascinating interpretation of this beloved story. In L. Frank Baum's original 1900 book, Dorothy's slippers weren't ruby at all. They were silver. When you see that detail alongside the yellow brick road, it unlocks a completely different reading of the story, one that transforms this children's fairy tale into what some scholars believe is one of the sharpest pieces of political commentary in American history. This isn't just about a girl trying to get back to Kansas anymore. According to a compelling theory, it's the story of a nation at war with itself over money, power, and who gets to control America's future. It's about a massive political battle that tore the country apart in the 1890s, a fight that many people have never even heard of. Today, we're pulling back the curtain. We'll travel back to the turn of the 20th century, a time of crushing economic hardship and populist anger that may have directly inspired this supposedly simple children's book. You'll discover who these characters you thought you knew might really represent. And by the end, you may never look at Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, or the Wizard the same way again. Because if this theory is right, this isn't just a story about finding your way home. It's about discovering where the real power in a nation lies, a message that feels just as relevant today as it was over a century ago. When America nearly broke, the crisis that shaped Oz. To understand this interpretation of Oz, you've got to understand the real Kansas first. Not the sepia-toned landscape from the 1939 film, but the economic and political powder keg it actually was in the 1890s. Picture America during the Gilded Age, Mark Twain's perfect name for a society that looked shiny on the outside but was rotten underneath. The metaphor was deliberate. Gilding meant covering cheap metal with a thin layer of gold, creating an illusion of wealth while hiding the worthless material beneath. On one side, you had the industrial titans, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. These men were building wealth on a scale nobody had ever seen before. Rockefeller became America's first billionaire. Carnegie's steel empire and Morgan's financial networks controlled vast chunks of the economy. They were America's new royalty, the clear winners in a rapidly changing world. But on the other side, you had most of the American people, and they definitely weren't winning. In the heartland, farmers were trapped in what felt like an impossible cycle. Crop prices kept falling while the costs of getting those crops to market stayed high, thanks to railroad monopolies that charged whatever rates they wanted. Think about the psychological toll here. These were men who'd fought in the Civil War, who'd pioneered the frontier, who believed deeply in the American promise that hard work led to prosperity. Now they watched their farms slip away, despite working harder than ever. Eastern newspapers called them ignorant hay seeds, who just didn't understand modern economics. Meanwhile, in the industrial cities, factory workers faced their own nightmare: 12 to 14-hour workdays in dangerous conditions for wages that barely supported their families. When economic depressions hit, and they hit with brutal regularity, these workers got tossed aside first. They weren't seen as people, but as cogs in a huge, dehumanizing machine. When they couldn't work anymore, they were left to rust in unemployment lines. The breaking point came with the Panic of 1893. It started when the Treasury announced that government gold reserves were running dangerously low. This sparked a massive run on gold, as everyone tried to convert their money and assets into the precious metal. The stock market crashed within 2 weeks, and the economic devastation that followed was unprecedented. The numbers tell a story of human misery. Unemployment soared from 3% in 1893 to nearly 19% by 1894. But those national averages hid even worse regional disasters. Unemployment hit 35% in New York State and a staggering 43% in Michigan. Banks collapsed by the hundreds. Factories shuttered. Railroads went bankrupt. For millions of regular Americans, it felt like the system was fundamentally broken. It felt like a great, powerful cyclone had swept in and thrown their lives into chaos. At the center of this storm was a fierce debate about money itself. What should American currency be based on? The powerful bankers of the East defended the gold standard, every dollar backed by a fixed amount of gold stored in government vaults. They argued this kept the currency stable and prevented inflation. But for farmers and workers, the gold standard was an economic straitjacket. Gold was naturally scarce, which limited the money supply and caused deflation. If you borrowed money when wheat sold for $1 per bushel and deflation drove the price down to 50 cents, you now had to grow twice as much wheat just to pay back the same loan. Your debt burden had effectively doubled through no fault of your own. This wasn't just an economic problem. It was a moral crisis. The people who produced America's food and manufactured its goods found themselves getting poorer, even as the nation's total wealth increased. The system seemed rigged in favor of those who owned money rather than those who worked for it. Out of this desperation rose the Populist Party, officially called the People's Party. The Populists were a grassroots movement of farmers and laborers who declared war on what they saw as a corrupt alliance between big business and government. Their main demand was revolutionary: break the grip of gold through free silver. They wanted the government to coin silver into money at a fixed ratio of 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. This would dramatically increase the money supply, since silver was much more plentiful than gold. The resulting inflation would make debts easier to pay and put more money into circulation. To creditors and bankers, this was economic heresy that would destroy the dollar's value. But to debtors, it was salvation. This fight between gold and silver became the defining political battle of the 1890s. It wasn't just about technical monetary policy. It was a moral crusade for America's future. Would the nation follow the sound money of gold, favored by the wealthy and powerful? Or would it choose the inflationary path of silver, demanded by the struggling masses? Kansas became ground zero for this conflict. By 1890, populist candidates were winning seats in the state legislature and Congress. 2 years later, Kansas populists gained control of the lower house and elected several congressmen. The state that Dorothy calls home was literally the epicenter of American populist revolt. This was the world L. Frank Baum lived in when he sat down to write what he claimed was simply a modern American fairy tale. But whether he intended it or not, the political and economic conflicts of his time would seep into every page of his supposedly innocent children's story. If your mind is already spinning with the real history behind Oz, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want to keep uncovering hidden meanings in our favorite stories, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what we pull back the curtain on next. The teacher who saw through the looking glass. Before we dive into the characters and their alleged meanings, you need to understand how this interpretation came to be. The man who first suggested that the Wizard of Oz was a political allegory wasn't some famous literary scholar. He was a high school history teacher named Henry Littlefield, trying to make a boring topic interesting for his students. In 1964, Littlefield was teaching at Mount Vernon High School in New York, struggling to get teenagers excited about the complex economic battles of the 1890s. The populist movement, the gold standard, bimetallism. These were abstract concepts that felt impossibly distant from his students' lives. But then Littlefield had a breakthrough. What if he could use a story they all knew to illustrate these historical forces? Littlefield published his theory in the American Quarterly in an article titled "The Wizard of Oz, Parable on Populism." His central argument was revolutionary. L. Frank Baum had written a sophisticated political allegory disguised as a children's fairy tale. Every major character, every significant symbol, every plot point corresponded to actual people and events from the 1890s political crisis. The article was an immediate sensation in academic circles. Here was a way to make 19th century history come alive to connect students with the fears and hopes of ordinary Americans facing economic catastrophe. Teachers across the country began using Littlefield's interpretation in their classrooms. But there was a problem with Littlefield's theory, one that became more apparent as scholars dug deeper. Despite creating this elaborate political reading, Littlefield had no direct evidence that Baum intended any such allegory. No letters, no diary entries, no statements from Baum himself acknowledging a hidden political message. In fact, the evidence pointed in the opposite direction. When researchers examined Baum's actual political views, they found something surprising. Baum wasn't a populist sympathizer at all. As editor of the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer newspaper in South Dakota, Baum had written editorials supporting Republican candidates and criticizing the emerging populist movement. Even more problematic for the theory, during the crucial 1896 presidential campaign that supposedly inspired his book, Baum published poetry celebrating William McKinley, the Republican candidate who defeated populist hero William Jennings Bryan. One verse read, "Our merchants won't be trembling at the Silverites dissembling when McKinley gets the chair." This was hardly the sentiment of a secret populist writing coded resistance literature. When confronted with this evidence, Littlefield himself acknowledged the weakness in his theory. In a 1992 response to critics, he conceded that there is no basis in fact to consider Baum a supporter of turn-of-the-century populist ideology. He emphasized that his original intention was pedagogical. My intention in this article was to suggest another means to teach a difficult period in American history. This raises a crucial question. If Baum wasn't a populist and never intended to write a political allegory, why has Littlefield's interpretation endured for 60 years? Why do the parallels between Oz and 1890s politics seem so compelling? The answer may lie in the difference between conscious allegory and unconscious reflection. Even if Baum didn't set out to write political commentary, he was still a man of his time, absorbing the anxieties and conflicts that dominated American life. The economic fears that drove the populist movement weren't confined to political activists. They permeated the entire culture. Moreover, the themes that resonate in both the Oz story and populist rhetoric are universal human concerns. Ordinary people versus distant authorities. The search for simple solutions to complex problems. The discovery that those in power may be less impressive than they appear. The realization that individuals possess more strength than they know. Perhaps most importantly, the theory's persistence reflects our own contemporary anxieties. Every generation facing economic uncertainty, political corruption, or feelings of powerlessness finds something relevant in both the Oz story and the populist message. Littlefield himself recognized this in his later reflections. Looking back over the 28 years since the publication of the article, he wrote, "I realized that it was Baum's genius that gave value to any commentary I might have added. The story's power doesn't depend on proving Baum's conscious intentions. It lies in the narrative's ability to illuminate timeless patterns of power and resistance." Understanding the theory's origins and limitations doesn't diminish its fascinating connections to real history. Even if these parallels are coincidental, they're too numerous and specific to dismiss entirely. So let's examine them closely, keeping in mind that we're exploring what the story could mean rather than what Baum definitely intended. Decoding the characters, a political cast in disguise. Now let's examine how Littlefield and subsequent scholars mapped the characters and symbols of Oz onto the political landscape of the 1890s. Whether intended or not, the connections are remarkably detailed and consistent. Let's start with the most symbolic elements, the path and the power. The yellow brick road represents the gold standard itself. It's the path everyone's told to follow to reach prosperity and political power. It looks bright and promising, gleaming with precious metal. But it's also hard, unforgiving, and ultimately leads to a place built on illusion. And what's Dorothy wearing on this road of gold? In Baum's original book, The Silver Shoes, not the ruby slippers MGM created for their Technicolor spectacular. Think about the symbolism here. She's literally walking on the road of gold while wearing silver on her feet. She embodies the populist solution with every step, the combination of gold and silver representing bimetallism. the 16-to-1 ratio that would increase the money supply and provide relief to debtors. The genius of this symbolism, if intentional, is that Dorothy doesn't realize the power of her silver shoes until the very end. She walks the entire difficult journey on the gold standard when the solution to her problems, returning home, was literally at her feet all along. This mirrors the populist argument that ordinary Americans already possessed the power to solve their economic problems through silver currency. They just needed to recognize and use it. So who is this girl carrying such powerful symbolism? Dorothy represents the American people, specifically the common citizen caught up in forces beyond her understanding. She's not wealthy or sophisticated. She's just a decent, resourceful person from Kansas trying to find her way home. Kansas itself was significant. By the 1890s, it had become the epicenter of populist political activity. Dorothy's journey begins with a cyclone, which populist rhetoric frequently used as a metaphor for their movement. Political speakers talked about the cyclone of reform sweeping across the Midwest, picking up farmers and workers and carrying them toward political action. The cyclone that carries Dorothy away from Kansas could represent this same political awakening. Dorothy's first companion is the scarecrow, who desperately wants a brain. In the allegorical reading, the scarecrow represents the American farmer, specifically Midwestern agricultural workers, who were often stereotyped by Eastern elites as ignorant and incapable of understanding complex economic issues. The cruel irony, as Baum presents it, is that the scarecrow consistently displays cleverness and wisdom throughout their journey. He has excellent ideas, shows strategic thinking, and often saves the group from danger. He doesn't lack intelligence. He lacks confidence and recognition. This perfectly captures the populist argument about farmers. Eastern newspapers and politicians constantly dismissed rural Americans as too ignorant to understand economics or politics. But farmers knew intimately how deflation affected crop prices, how railroad monopolies manipulated shipping rates, and how distant financial decisions impacted their daily lives. They weren't stupid. They were systematically excluded from economic power and political representation. Next comes the Tin Woodman, rusted solid and yearning for a heart. The allegorical interpretation sees him as the industrial worker, the factory employee who's been dehumanized by the mechanical nature of his labor. His origin story is particularly telling. He was once a man of flesh and blood, but through a series of accidents, he had to replace his body parts with tin until he became more machine than human. This serves as a powerful metaphor for industrialization's effects on workers. The factory system didn't just employ people, it transformed them into components of a larger machine. Workers lost their individual identities, their human connections, their ability to take pride in craftsmanship. They became interchangeable parts in an industrial process that valued efficiency over humanity. The Tin Woodman's rust represents unemployment during the Depression of the 1890s. When economic conditions deteriorated, workers weren't laid off. They were abandoned, left to rust in place until economic conditions improved and someone came to oil them back to productivity. The last member of the group is the Cowardly Lion, searching for courage. This character presents the most specific allegorical connection. Most scholars interpret him as William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic and populist presidential candidate in 1896. Bryan was famous for his powerful voice and commanding presence. He could roar with the best of them, delivering speeches that electrified crowds. Bryan's most famous moment was his Cross of Gold speech at the 1896 Democratic National Convention. Standing before delegates in Chicago, he delivered one of the most powerful pieces of political oratory in American history, concluding with the thunderous declaration, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." But Bryan lost the election to William McKinley, carrying mainly rural states, while McKinley won the more populous industrial regions. To his critics, Bryan seemed like all roar and no action, a lion who could make impressive sounds but lacked the political courage or skill to actually win power and implement change. The theory extends to the story's villains as well. The wicked witch of the East, who's crushed at the beginning when Dorothy's house lands on her, allegedly represents the Eastern financial establishment, the Wall Street bankers, bondholders, and monopolists who controlled the nation's money supply. Her elimination liberates the silver shoes, symbolizing that breaking the power of Eastern finance was the first step toward monetary freedom. The Wicked Witch of the West represents the harsh economic forces plaguing Western farmers. Railroad monopolies that charged excessive shipping rates, mortgage companies that foreclosed on farms, and natural disasters like droughts that destroyed crops. It's symbolically appropriate that she's defeated by water, the one thing that could end a drought and restore agricultural prosperity. So now our allegorical group is complete. The American people leading the farmers and industrial workers alongside their political champion, all walking the gold standard path powered by the hope of silver, heading toward the seat of power to demand economic justice. Their destination raises perhaps the most ingenious aspect of the alleged allegory: the Emerald City, which represents Washington, D.C. Why green? It's the color of money, specifically the greenback paper dollars that had been issued during the Civil War. But the truly brilliant satirical touch, if intentional, is that in Baum's book, the city only appears green because all its inhabitants are required to wear green-tinted spectacles that are locked onto their heads. Remove the glasses, and the city is no more emerald than anywhere else. This serves as a devastating metaphor for the illusion of prosperity and the power of perception in politics. The city's supposed wealth and grandeur exist only because citizens are forced to see it through a distorted lens. At the center of this illusory city sits the Wizard of Oz himself. In the allegorical reading, Oz stands for ounce, the standard measurement for precious metals, particularly gold and silver. The wizard becomes the personification of the monetary system itself, the measure of value that everyone seeks, but no one truly understands. When Dorothy and her companions finally meet him, the wizard appears in different forms to each visitor, trying to be all things to all people, much like politicians who tailor their messages to different constituencies. But when Toto pulls back the curtain, they discover he's just an ordinary man from Omaha, Nebraska, operating an elaborate illusion with mechanical devices and theatrical tricks. This reveals the story's most subversive message. The seemingly awesome power of government and financial institutions is largely based on illusion and the consent of the governed. The wizard has no real magical powers, no genuine solutions to offer. He can give certificates and tokens, but these are empty gestures that represent recognition rather than actual change. When reality mirrored fantasy, the March on Washington. The journey down the yellow brick road takes on new meaning when we consider its real-world parallel. The various armies of unemployed workers who literally marched on Washington during the 1890s Depression. The most famous was Coxey's Army, led by Ohio businessman Jacob Coxey in 1894. Coxey's march began in Massillon, Ohio, on Easter Sunday, March 25, 1894. Starting with about 100 unemployed men, the group walked approximately 400 miles over 5 weeks, arriving in Washington, D.C. on May 1, 1894. Along the way, they picked up supporters and attracted massive media attention. By the time they reached the Capitol, their numbers had grown to about 500 people. The parallels to Dorothy's journey are striking, whether coincidental or intentional. Like Dorothy's group, Coxey's Army consisted of ordinary Americans, farmers, factory workers, and the unemployed, traveling together toward the seat of government to ask for help. They walked hundreds of miles on foot, camping along the way, sustained by hope that once they reached Washington, those in power would listen and provide solutions. Coxey's specific demands were remarkably similar to what populists advocated. He wanted the federal government to create jobs through public works projects, funded by issuing more currency, essentially increasing the money supply to stimulate economic activity. This was precisely the kind of inflationary policy that free silver supporters promoted. But when Coxey's army finally reached Washington, they met with the same disillusionment that Dorothy and her friends experienced with the wizard. Instead of being welcomed as concerned citizens, petitioning their government, they were treated as a dangerous mob. Police arrested Coxey and other leaders when they tried to speak on the Capitol steps, charging them with trespassing on federal property. The arrest was symbolic of how the political establishment viewed the economic crisis. Rather than addressing the underlying problems that had driven hundreds of people to walk across multiple states, authorities focused on maintaining order and preserving property rights. The marchers dispersed, their leaders went to jail, and the Depression continued. Congressional response to Coxey's army was dismissive and often cruel. One congressman declared that the march was a failure because unemployment was an act of God, essentially arguing that economic suffering was natural and inevitable rather than something government could address. This attitude perfectly captures the wizard's response, offering empty tokens instead of real solutions. But Coxey's army wasn't the only group making this journey. More than 40 different armies of unemployed workers headed toward Washington in 1894, though most never made it to the capital. These groups came from across the country: California, Montana, Colorado, and other states hit hard by the economic collapse. Like Dorothy picking up companions along the yellow brick road, these marches gathered supporters as they traveled. The failure of these marches to achieve meaningful change may have reinforced the populist message that conventional political processes were inadequate. If marching to Washington and petitioning government officials couldn't solve the crisis, then perhaps more fundamental changes were needed. This brings us to the story's most powerful moment, the revelation that Dorothy had the power to go home all along. Glinda the Good Witch tells her that the silver shoes could have transported her back to Kansas at any time. She just needed to know how to use them. The silver shoes, Glinda explains, have wonderful powers. And one of the most curious things about them is that they can carry you to any place in the world in 3 steps. In the allegorical reading, this becomes the ultimate populist message. The power to solve economic problems doesn't lie in distant capitals or with prestigious authorities. It rests with ordinary people who need to recognize and use the tools they already possess. But Dorothy needed to make the journey to learn this lesson. She had to experience the futility of seeking solutions from traditional authority figures before she could understand that the power she sought was always within reach. Similarly, the populist movement argued that Americans needed to stop deferring to Eastern financial experts and Washington politicians who had created the problems in the first place. From silver to ruby, how Hollywood changed history. The transformation of Dorothy's silver shoes into ruby slippers for MGM's 1939 film adds another fascinating layer to this story, one that inadvertently obscured the political interpretation for generations. The decision to change the color wasn't made for artistic or narrative reasons. It was purely technical, designed to showcase the studio's new Technicolor technology. Early drafts of the MGM screenplay from May 1938 had kept the shoes silver, faithful to Baum's original story. But as production progressed, filmmakers realized that silver shoes wouldn't create the visual impact they wanted. Technicolor was expensive and relatively new. MGM wanted to demonstrate the technology's capacity for vibrant, eye-catching colors that would make audiences gasp. Ruby red provided the perfect solution. The deep crimson slippers would pop against the yellow brick road, creating a visual contrast that silver simply couldn't match. The decision was purely practical. Red looked better on screen than silver in Technicolor film stock. But this technical choice had profound implications for how subsequent generations understood the story. For 60 years, most Americans knew only the ruby slippers, completely unaware that the original shoes were silver. The color change severed the connection to monetary symbolism that was central to the allegorical interpretation. This highlights how artistic and commercial decisions can inadvertently alter cultural understanding. MGM's Technicolor showcase became the definitive version of the story for most people, overshadowing Baum's original text. The allegorical reading remained primarily confined to academic circles and history classrooms, while popular culture embraced the more spectacular but less politically symbolic ruby version. The irony is particularly sharp when we consider that MGM's decision actually reinforced some of the story's themes about illusion and the power of appearances. The studio chose visual spectacle over narrative authenticity, prioritizing how the film looked rather than what it meant. In a sense, they became like the wizard himself, using technical tricks and impressive displays to distract audiences from deeper meanings. Recent adaptations have begun to restore the silver shoes, most notably in the musical Wicked and its film adaptation. These productions return to Baum's original vision, using silver footwear that maintains the monetary symbolism while avoiding copyright issues with MGM's ruby design. Why we keep finding hidden meanings. The persistence of the populist interpretation of Oz reveals something profound about how humans process stories and meaning. Even without definitive proof of Baum's intentions, millions of people have found the allegorical reading compelling and illuminating. This suggests that the theory speaks to psychological and cultural needs that transcend its historical accuracy. First, there's the appeal of hidden knowledge. The idea that a beloved children's story contains sophisticated political commentary makes readers feel intellectually superior to those who accept the tale at face value. It transforms a simple fairy tale into a puzzle that rewards careful analysis and historical knowledge. But the theory's endurance runs deeper than intellectual vanity. The themes it identifies, ordinary people versus powerful elites, the illusion of authority, the discovery of inner strength, resonate across different historical periods because they address universal human experiences. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, when MGM produced their film version, audiences could easily identify with Dorothy's journey from economic hardship to the discovery that solutions lay within reach. The message that distant authorities might be less powerful than they appeared offered comfort to people struggling with unemployment and financial insecurity. The civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s gave the story new relevance. The idea that oppressed groups already possessed the power to change their circumstances, they just needed to recognize and use it, aligned with the philosophy of grassroots organizing and nonviolent resistance. The economic upheavals of the 1970s and 1980s, with their inflation, unemployment, and industrial decline, again made the populist themes feel contemporary. Workers who felt left behind by technological change and global competition could see themselves in the Tin Woodman, rusted in place and waiting for someone to oil them back to productivity. Most recently, the political polarization and economic inequality of the 21st century have given the Oz allegory new life. The revelation that the wizard is just an ordinary person behind a curtain resonates with voters who feel disillusioned with political institutions and suspicious of elite expertise. This adaptability helps explain why the theory persists, despite scholarly skepticism about Baum's intentions. The interpretation serves as a kind of political test, allowing each generation to project its own anxieties and aspirations onto the familiar story. There's also a psychological satisfaction in discovering patterns and connections between disparate elements. The human brain is wired to seek meaning and coherence, even in random events. When someone points out that Dorothy's companions represent different segments of American society, readers experience the pleasure of recognition, the aha moment, when seemingly unrelated details suddenly form a coherent pattern. Scholars weigh in the great academic debate. The scholarly response to Littlefield's theory has been mixed, with some historians embracing it as a useful teaching tool, while others reject it as unsubstantiated speculation. Understanding this academic debate helps us evaluate the theory's strengths and weaknesses more carefully. Supporters of the allegorical interpretation point to the sheer number of parallels between the Oz story and 1890s politics. The connections seem too numerous and specific to be purely coincidental. The silver shoes on the golden road, the scarecrow's intelligence despite claims of ignorance, the Tin Woodman's humanity despite mechanical appearance, the cowardly lion's powerful voice, the green-tinted glasses creating illusions of wealth. All of these elements align remarkably well with populist themes. Economists have particularly embraced the theory because it illustrates complex monetary concepts in accessible terms. The relationship between gold standard deflation and debt burdens, the effects of increasing money supply through silver coinage, the conflict between creditors and debtors. These abstract economic principles become concrete when embodied in a familiar narrative. Hugh Rockoff, an economist at Rutgers University, wrote extensively supporting the allegorical interpretation, arguing that the monetary symbolism is too consistent and detailed to be accidental. He notes that Baum lived through the political and economic upheavals of the 1890s, worked as a journalist, and would have been intimately familiar with the debates over monetary policy. But critics raised significant objections to the theory. The most serious challenge remains the lack of evidence for Baum's conscious intentions. Michael Patrick Hearn, a leading Baum scholar, found no evidence that Baum's story is in any way a populist allegory, and concluded that the Littlefield reading has no basis in fact. The discovery of Baum's actual political views further undermines the theory. If Baum was a Republican who supported McKinley and opposed populism, why would he write a story promoting populist ideology? The biographical evidence suggests he was more likely to satirize populist ideas than to advocate for them. Some scholars argue that the allegorical interpretation reads modern concerns back into a historical text. Anne Mayhew, an economic historian, points out that the specific complaints attributed to 1890s farmers don't align well with actual economic conditions of the period. Railroad rates and interest rates were actually falling during the 1890s, and credit was relatively available. There's also the problem of selective interpretation. Critics note that allegorical readings tend to emphasize elements that support the theory while ignoring those that don't. Many characters and plot points in the Oz story have no clear parallels in 1890s politics. The Good Witch of the North, the Kalidas, the Fighting Trees, the China Country. These elements resist easy allegorical interpretation. Perhaps most importantly, the theory may underestimate Baum's primary achievement as a storyteller. By focusing on political symbolism, the allegorical interpretation can obscure the genuine literary merits that made the story enduringly popular. The academic debate ultimately reflects different approaches to literary interpretation. Those who support the allegorical reading tend to emphasize the cultural context in which texts are produced, arguing that all literature reflects the social and political concerns of its time, whether authors intend it or not. Those who reject the theory typically demand stronger evidence of authorial intention. From 1900 to today, why Oz still resonates. The continuing relevance of both the Oz story and its alleged political interpretation reflects the persistence of the underlying conflicts they supposedly address. More than a century after Baum wrote his tale, American society still grapples with questions about economic inequality, political representation, and the relationship between ordinary citizens and powerful institutions. The 2008 financial crisis created conditions remarkably similar to those of the 1890s. Banks that seemed too big to fail suddenly teetered on the edge of collapse. Unemployment soared as entire industries contracted. Ordinary Americans who had played by the rules watched their financial security evaporate due to decisions made by distant financial institutions. The political response echoed themes from the populist era and the Oz story. Protesters demanded accountability from Wall Street executives, but those executives often seemed as confused and powerless as the wizard behind his curtain. Government officials promised solutions, but their remedies frequently amounted to symbolic gestures. The rise of populist movements on both the political left and right reflects the same frustrations that drove the People's Party in the 1890s. Many Americans express skepticism about traditional political authorities and economic elites, seeking leaders who claim to represent ordinary people against corrupt establishments. The metaphor of pulling back the curtain has become ubiquitous in contemporary political discourse. Journalists promise to reveal the hidden truth behind official statements. Activists claim to expose the real agenda behind policy proposals. The image of the great and powerful Oz being revealed as an ordinary person has become shorthand for any revelation that authority figures are less impressive than they pretend to be. Technology has created new versions of the green-tinted glasses that supposedly made the Emerald City appear more magnificent than it actually was. Social media algorithms create filter bubbles that reinforce users' existing beliefs, making political opponents seem more extreme and political allies seem more numerous than they actually are. The story's message about inner strength and collective power continues to resonate with social movements seeking change. The silver shoes become a metaphor for any tool or strategy that empowers grassroots organizing. But the contemporary relevance of the Oz allegory also reveals its limitations. The story's focus on monetary policy and 19th century political structures may be less applicable to 21st century challenges. Issues like climate change, technological disruption, and global inequality require solutions that go beyond the silver and gold debates. Moreover, the story's individualistic message, that Dorothy always had the power to go home, may be less helpful for addressing collective problems that require coordinated action and institutional change. Some challenges require the kind of powerful institutions and effective government that the Oz story seems to mock. The allegorical interpretation may also oversimplify the complex relationship between ordinary citizens and democratic institutions. While skepticism about political authorities is healthy, complete rejection of expertise and institutional knowledge can lead to dangerous movements that undermine democratic norms. The real magic of Oz. So what is the real meaning of The Wizard of Oz? After examining the historical evidence, academic debates, and contemporary relevance, we're left with a story that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It remains, first and foremost, a masterfully crafted adventure tale that has entertained children and adults for more than a century. Baum succeeded in his stated goal of creating a modern American fairy tale free from the violence and grimness of European folk stories. But beneath that surface narrative lies a rich vein of symbolism and meaning that has proved endlessly adaptable to different historical moments and political perspectives. Whether Baum consciously intended to write a populist allegory matters less than the fact that his story can sustain such an interpretation while continuing to work as entertainment. The evidence suggests that Baum was not a secret populist, writing coded resistance literature. His personal politics aligned with Republican positions, and he showed no sympathy for the monetary reforms that supposedly inspire his story. Henry Littlefield, who created the allegorical interpretation, acknowledged that he intended it as a teaching tool rather than a statement of historical fact. Yet the parallels between the Oz story and 1890s politics remain too numerous and specific to dismiss as pure coincidence. Baum lived through the economic and political upheavals of his era. Even if he wasn't consciously promoting populist ideology, he absorbed the anxieties and conflicts that permeated American culture during the Depression of the 1890s. The transformation of silver shoes into ruby slippers for MGM's film version illustrates how commercial and artistic decisions can alter cultural understanding. The studio's choice to showcase Technicolor technology inadvertently obscured the monetary symbolism that modern readers find so compelling. The enduring appeal of the allegorical interpretation reflects our ongoing struggles with economic inequality, political corruption, and institutional legitimacy. Each generation finds new relevance in the story's themes because the underlying conflicts between ordinary people and powerful elites persist across different historical periods. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Oz controversy is about the nature of meaning itself. Stories don't exist in isolation. They interact with readers' experiences, cultural assumptions, and historical contexts to create significance that may exceed what authors originally intended. The debate over Oz's political meaning demonstrates how the same narrative can serve different purposes for different audiences. Economists use it to teach monetary policy. Historians use it to illustrate populist themes. Political activists use it to advocate for grassroots organizing. Children use it to explore imagination and adventure. All of these readings have value. The story's most profound message may be its demonstration that ordinary people possess more power and wisdom than they realize, but also that recognizing this power requires a journey of discovery. Dorothy can't simply click her heels and return home at the beginning. She needs to experience the futility of seeking solutions from traditional authorities before she can understand that she already possesses what she needs. This speaks to a truth about both personal growth and social change. Transformation rarely comes from external rescuers or magical solutions. It emerges from the difficult process of recognizing our own capabilities and taking responsibility for using them. The Wizard of Oz endures not because it contains a hidden political message, but because it embodies this timeless insight about human potential. In an age of complex global challenges and institutional failures, the story reminds us that solutions may be simpler and closer than we imagine. But the story also warns us about the seductive appeal of simple answers to complex problems. The wizard's promises are appealing precisely because they offer easy solutions without requiring personal effort or change. The revelation that he's a fraud forces Dorothy and her companions to take responsibility for their own lives rather than depending on external authorities. This tension between empowerment and responsibility makes the Oz story as relevant today as it was in 1900. Whether we're facing personal challenges or collective crises, the story suggests that we already possess the tools we need. We just need the wisdom to recognize them and the courage to use them. That may be the real magic of Oz, not the discovery of hidden political meanings, but the reminder that the most important transformations happen when ordinary people realize their own extraordinary potential. The yellow brick road leads not to external salvation, but to self-discovery. The silver shoes, or ruby slippers, carry us not to a distant paradise, but back home to ourselves. In the end, perhaps Dorothy's most important realization isn't that she can click her heels and return to Kansas, but that she no longer needs to escape from her life there. The journey has changed her understanding of home, power, and possibility. She returns not as the same frightened girl who was carried away by a cyclone, but as someone who has discovered her own strength and learned to value what she already had. That's a lesson worth learning, whether you believe in populist allegories or not. And it's the kind of timeless wisdom that ensures The Wizard of Oz will continue to resonate with new generations of readers, regardless of what hidden meanings they may or may not find in its pages. If this journey down the yellow brick road opened your eyes to hidden meanings you never saw before, there's so much more to discover. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because next week we're pulling back the curtain on another beloved classic that's hiding secrets in plain sight. You won't believe what we've uncovered about It's a Wonderful Life and its connections to post-war American anxieties. Trust me, after what you've just learned, you'll want to see what other stories have been keeping secrets from us all these years.